Thank you, and welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau, and presented by ICF International. Today's roundtable features a distinguished panel from 3 states who will discuss their experiences and challenges relating to the recording of intake calls. I'm Joyce Rose, your host and facilitator for today's discussion. Next slide, please. I want to thank our panelists for their time and effort in preparing for this roundtable. So let's meet them. We have Lori Lipscomb, who is the Service Area Manager for the Iowa Department of Human Services. Joining us is Linda Holland, Director of Information Technology for the New Jersey Department of Children and Families, and Jack Hilbert, who is the Hotline Manager for the Colorado Office of Children, Youth, and Families. We thought that Mr. Hilbert was not going to join us today due to a mandatory meeting, which he got out of early. So we are glad that he is on board because of the uniqueness that Colorado is a state-managed, county-administered state, different from Iowa and New Jersey. So our processes will be a bit different. So next slide, please. Attendees are encouraged to participate in the roundtable with questions or comments. All of the participant lines are muted now, but we will open them for the Q&A session at the end of the discussion. Please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the GoToWebinar chat feature, and those will be queued up and addressed during the Q&A session. Once today's roundtable has ended, you may submit additional questions to the email address listed, or to your federal analyst, or through the chat feature, or via the operator by pressing *1 on your phone.
If you have any questions, please email ccwis.questions@acf.hhs.gov.
Next slide, please. So our roundtable format. I will pose a series of questions to our state panelists focusing on these topics, which I trust will give rise to an informational as well as lively discussion. And those topics are: our states will explain their decision to record intake calls. We'll talk about security and the use of the recordings, and then, as always, identify some lessons learned. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, that's just a reminder that you can submit questions at any point in time. So let's start our questioning, and we're going to start with Linda Holland. And the question is, please describe the background and history of your state's decision to record intake calls.
Thank you, Joyce. So this is Linda Holland. I also have with me Robin Giles, who's our manager of our hotline, and Nancy Carey Lee, who's one of our assistant directors. So the background is really pretty simple for us. We rolled out our SACWIS system in stages, and we rolled out our centralized intake in 2004. For quality assurance purposes, we decided to start recording our calls in 2005. Subsequent to that, a few years ago, there was a recommendation by our Child Fatality and Review Board, and I think we had also been talking about it internally before that, but that kind of gave us the push we needed to make it happen faster. We are now attaching those calls or a link to those calls to our SACWIS system so that caseworkers, prior to going out on the intakes or investigations, can listen to the calls. And so we did that in 2015. So that's really like the background and history of why we just started to do it. Anecdotally, I can say that the staff are thrilled to have those calls. You know, there's always that issue with your screening hotline and your caseworkers. Why did they take this? Or, you know, this doesn't sound right. Or even with families that being able to listen to the call and hearing, someone's voice, you can kind of see, I don't want to say how serious it is, but it gives the workers a little bit extra in understanding the circumstances of what they're going out to see or investigate, especially if it's a family member that's called and or if there's a domestic violence situation that later can be denied, et cetera. So the workers really find having the calls available to them to be very, very helpful.
And also, at the hotline, we can't capture everything the reporter says. So having that call linked to the case record to get all of the information so that they can have more of a holistic view of the call and the concerns is also a benefit for our investigators.
And it does minimize the amount of callbacks from the local office staff to the hotline, because oftentimes before this system, the local office caseworkers would contact the hotline to get more information or to ask why it was coded a certain way. And so this really gives them the opportunity to have that real concrete information that might not have necessarily been recorded on the screen and template.
Great. Lori, can you add the history and background from your state, from Iowa, please?
Sure, I can, and mine will be even shorter than that. So we centralized our intake statewide back in 2010. And so that unit, at that time when it was formed, we decided to start recording calls for a couple of reasons. One, and I'll oversimplify by saying protection. The other is for performance. So the protection piece is we had a high-profile case just before that time, a few years before that time, that had some allegations that folks were reporting abuse, but there was no record of it anywhere in our system. So we decided recording calls was a way for us to be able to say, nope, we have no record, and here's why we're recording all these calls. So that was one reason. The other was around performance, and I don't mean that necessarily from the perspective of, personnel issues, but rather the quality of the intakes. So we use that today for doing call reviews and just working with our staff on, better interviewing, better recording of the allegations. So we really use it in a quality improvement way. We also use that, if we get a complaint from a customer or something, we may go back and listen to the call and address any issues we see at that time. But really it was for protection and performance.
And Lori, I'm curious, because this was eventually used for performance improvements, et cetera, what type of marketing or training did you do to promote the positivity of recording calls with the workers?
Yeah, that's a really great question. At the time that we kind of announced to staff that that's what we were going to be doing, there was obviously a lot of concern. They were feeling a bit paranoid that we were going to be using it in ways that impacted them personnel-wise. And so really it was more about just focusing on the positive aspect for them of the protection and being able to say, no, you captured the right information in the intake, so if field was pushing you back or if, a customer said we got something wrong, it's recorded. So it was, we really pushed more that benefit to them and then just really focused on the positive part of performance and quality improvement, and really, I think, appropriately downplayed the use of it as kind of a discipline or a personnel sort of tool. So I think it was just more focusing on the messaging around protection and protection for them.
Great. So, Jack, I'm sorry. Would you explain Colorado's background and history, please?
Yeah, well, discussions began in about 2010. However, we finally, after a lot of resistance and pushback, we actually got the legislation approved to move forward with a statewide system for managing the hotline calls, and that's at the same time we integrated recording into that. Now, what complicated it in the state of Colorado, as you said before, we are a state-supervised, county-managed, meaning then we have 64 counties, and each one of them can stand autonomously to a degree. Others, they just have to follow certain process policies, rules, and laws. But So trying to get all the calls from 64 counties to route into a central recording process was a challenge, but we accomplished that, so that was fine. I'm not going to go into that. But there's nothing much to add more than the fact that Linda, dittoing what Linda and Lori said, because quite frankly, that's all the reasons why we did it, and I think the protection factor is a big one. I would like to say, though, that we did get a couple of counties pushing back hard about the legalities of recording, and we had to get some rulings from our AG's office on that, but everything then was handled and appropriate, and the fact that we could record those calls based upon Colorado state law. And so I think other than that, at this point in time, I would say this, after being up and operating for 3.5 years completely, they would not go back. They depend on those recordings. They live by those recordings now, and they're so happy they have them. Where if you would have gone back 3.5 years earlier, you're right, there would have been a lot of concern about recording their calls. So.
Great. Thank you so very much. Let's move on then to the next question, and we're going to start with Lori. And the question is, if there were any barriers to recording intake calls, what were they, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so this really fits nicely with the first question. I've already kind of alluded to some of it, but the biggest barrier, I think, at the time was staff just really needing to better understand why we were doing it, how we were going to use the recordings, and that sort of thing. So, again, it was around the messaging. And I think we overcame the barrier fairly easily right out of the gate. The staff were just concerned about the intrusiveness, too. They didn't know, would we be listening to them right away, coming to them right away, and correcting them, things like that. So, again, not to be redundant, but it just went back to messaging with them, and I think we were fairly successful at getting them through that transition. And I don't know that they would want to go back either at this point. I think it's been really helpful for them as well.
Great. That's a positive thing to hear. Linda.
So I think there's a couple of things. One is just being able to record the calls, and then subsequently, how we have them or the link attached. We're dealing with a vendor for our phone services, so that adds a new wrinkle when you don't have state. It's not a state-run service, right? So I think we have questions later on about security and whatnot, but that was definitely a barrier and a technical challenge specifically for the IT staff. And it took, nothing's a 5-minute job, right? No change in your SACWA system. We don't even use the word easy, right? So this was something, that my team did embrace, but it was a lot of work for them, and I think one of the lessons learned for us here was that, look, there are a lot of different products out there that can help you to do this. We are limited by state contract, unfortunately, and I think that kind of tied our hands a little bit. I think knowing what we know now, we probably would have pushed back for maybe a different product. And now we're much, the IT staff that's here now is, we've all been here for several years. We understand how all the rules work now, and so we're better at pushing back. Back in the day, we'd be like, okay, that's it. It's the only choice. I guess there's nothing we can do. Now, we fight back. So if you're thinking about doing this, really take the time on the front end to be very planful and think about it. When we first started to record the calls, I don't think we had a vision of attaching them at the time. That might have changed the way we did some things, but ultimately when we moved to attach them, we were very successful in being able to do that relatively quickly. I'm going to let Robin talk a little bit more about how her staff responded to the recording of the calls and their fears and how she helped them to overcome that.
So in the beginning, we started recording the calls very early in our centralized life. We started recording about a year out from when centralized screening was developed here at New Jersey. So our staff in the beginning really didn't have much pushback. They welcomed it because it helped also if we missed something on the phone, we were able to replay the phone call. Initially, you would have to go to a supervisor to be able to listen to your phone call, but if we missed information, if someone said something very fast, if they were speaking low, we were able to use it as a tool. So most of my staff at that time were not fearful of the calls being recorded. From the beginning, on our message, we stated that the calls were being recorded for quality assurance, so the callers were aware that the phone calls were being recorded. And in the beginning, we just used it as a supervisory training tool and also just to help us if we needed to get additional information from that call that we were not able to get during the first round of speaking to the person live. Their fears came, believe it or not, when we started attaching the calls for our caseworkers to start to review them. My staff were very fearful that their peers in the local office were going to be calling back just criticizing how they handled the call, and it was quite the opposite. We actually got more support from the local office, knowing how challenging it can be to process a call, how you have to diffuse callers and still elicit information. It really was a positive. That they got to understand our operation a little bit better of how we have to elicit information from people. So that was one of the biggest fears of my workers was when we started attaching those calls to investigations. Something about a barrier in the beginning. If you're building your system now, something that I would suggest too is that in the beginning, we didn't really have identifiers. Like, say if we had to trace a callback, we needed to know, like, that half-hour time frame because we didn't build the system in the beginning to identify each agent number specific to phone calls. So we would have to say, okay, a call came in between this half an hour if we really needed to go back to track it. And that was really difficult. And that we didn't think about that until like maybe 2 years or 2.5 years into our phone recording. So if you can, I think now the technology I hope that it comes that way now, but if it doesn't, I would highly stress that you would need to get every agent, your screeners, identifying information so when they get a call, it identifies that they took that call in the system so that you're not, if you have to review a call, you're not searching for that call just by time frames.
Great. Jack, what about barriers in Colorado?
And if it's all right with you, Joyce, what I'd like to do is kind of combine 2 and 3 since I kick off the next one. They are somewhat related. And so if I can, I'll probably just bring both of those together in this, similar to what I think Linda just discussed and Robin. The biggest barrier we had was a geographic issue where we had 64 counties remotely dispersed with 64 different phone systems that we had to bring together. Secondly, then, was how did we get all of those into a single system that could then feed our SACWIS system at the same time and link them? So we ended up going with a WebNet-based system, somewhat custom written, and then we wrote specific application interfaces into our phone system that would feed the data we needed about the phone call directly into that WebNet system that captured it. Now, the reason that's important is because it is there then through the call management system that we went with and the entire cloud-based system that we were able to, as Robin just talked about some of their barriers, every person has a unique identifier. We call it an ID, every call taker does. And every call that comes in generates a unique call recording ID, and every call then generates a unique hotline ID as a reference. That hotline ID is important because what it does then is from there you can categorize the type of call into the various types of calls because we record everything. So whether it's child welfare, non-child welfare, whether it's a PA4, PA5, et cetera, et cetera. Now we have all the data captured as it pertains to the call taker, the time, the date, the actual incident, the hotline number associated with it. And when you're done documenting that particular incident in that record that it automatically opens up for you and creates, what it does, it automatically submits it and records it into the SACWIS system as a record, okay? It actually is part of the SACWIS system, but we submit that in there then so that we have that permanent record. in that ID contains the link, so that if you were to click on and you open that up, there's an icon that will show you the length of the recording, and you can actually has a scroll bar, so you can go back and forth at any point and pull that out. So you've got all the identifiers that you need. The biggest barrier we ran into was getting those application interfaces programmed with the various vendors to work really good in that upfront piece. And that's why we went to a completely 100% cloud-based system. We had to in order to meet the geographic demands that we had here in Colorado. So from that standpoint, I think it has worked incredibly well for us, to be quite honest with you. And the biggest barriers, like again, I previously mentioned that we had to overcome was the fear factors of you're recording my calls. Can you legally do that, et cetera, which we got past that right away. And then just making sure we worked out the tweaks with the various vendors and our IT department and making sure that the interfaces worked correctly and that we could capture those. So quite frankly, we're very pleased with it, incredibly pleased with it.
Great. I want to swing back to Lori and Linda for just a second. Jack, you touched on it. Did you experience or did your callers experience any heightened anxiety knowing that everything they were reporting was being recorded?
The answer is yes. In the state of Colorado, this is what you have to understand, though, it's a little bit different. In the state of Colorado, you do not have to announce that you're recording calls if one party on the end knows it's being recorded on one end or the other, so it's kind of crazy. But the fact of the matter is we do and posted it out and have told all of our providers and everyone that these calls are indeed recorded, quote, unquote. And so there was, in the beginning, some heightened concern and anxiety. If they choose to have anonymity, obviously they don't have to provide any information that they normally would not. One of the ways in which we'll be talking about it later, though, we get around that is that our recordings are secured, encrypted, and you're not allowed to gain access to it. And, in fact, we do not provide copies of the recordings to anyone. Well, I'll wait on that one. So.
Okay. Lori, Linda, do you have anything to add in terms of your experience with those people calling in knowing they were being recorded?
So this is Linda. We have a disclaimer, I guess you would call it. When the phone is answered, it indicates to you that the call is being recorded for quality assurance, and also the screener says it. Mm-hmm. So I just leaned over to Robin to ask if we thought we saw, when we had initially rolled this out, was there a lot of hang-ups after that? But it doesn't, from our indications, there were not.
Right.
So they're like I said, they're told in the recording that it answers the phone. It says, if you're calling for child abuse or neglect, press 1. If you're calling for institutional abuse or an issue, and there's another number to push. So in there, it's indicated. And again, like I said, the screener says it each time, because every time I call SCR to check on them, they record my call as well.
Got it. Lori?
Yeah, we have not had pushback from callers about being recorded. I texted my manager down there to ask him if we actually announce it on our recording. I thought we did, but he's, I think, typing right now and listening as well, so he'll tell me in a second here. But no, we've not had any pushback from callers.
Okay.
And yeah, he said, yep, we do. We announce it at the phone prompt, so our phone tree, when you're pushing the 1 for child abuse, it will announce that we record calls.
Great, thank you. And we just heard from Jack about how their recordings are linked to their child welfare information systems. Linda, can you explain how yours are linked?
So the calls are stored on the actual server that we use. It's the NICE server. That's the system that we use. They are stored on their server. That server is located physically in our building. Okay, so we have a link directly that gets the link gets attached to the to the intake, and that when workers receive the intake, they merely click on the link. It brings them to that direct call, so they don't have to scroll through anything. Each call is individually linked to each intake. Robin, do you have anything is there a process that your workers have to do to make sure it's linked?
They have to search the system out for the calls they receive. There's a search box that they just note the time that they took it so that they can attach the correct call. And for our screeners, they can play back their call so they can actually hit it, make sure it's the correct call, and then they link it. They just have to check a box in our SACWIS system that links the call to the report.
Ah, cool. Okay, Lori?
Yeah, we do not link the calls. They're stored, and if anybody wants to see them, the caseworker, if they want to hear it before they go out on their assessment, they can do that. They can request it. We don't have that very much, but it is interesting to me and really timely as Iowa heads into planning for our new CCWIS system. I would like to explore this, so would be reaching out to the other two resources on the call today to ask more questions. But no, we do not link ours in the SACWIS system.
Okay, there we have 3 states doing 3 diverse things, but it all seems to work. So let's move on to the next question, and Jack, we're going to have you kick this off. How long do you retain recordings?
Well, this was up for a huge debate when we kicked this off, and because what happens with retention of recordings, you run into the cost of storage space and the quality and changing technology. So just like, what does this prove? But what we ended up doing was obtaining in our original up system, which is it's a digital system, and we do have on a server. We, in our case, use CenturyLink, but in this particular case, we store and we plan for storage for 25 years plus 1 day. Oh, it sounds kind of weird, but why 25 years plus 1 day? Child welfare, child, youth, and obviously are from moment of birth until until you turn 18. So there's 18 plus 7 years for a statute of limitations, and 1 day is a buffer. That's what we did. Now, that's ironic. That's how we measured our storage capacity. However, you can obviously download and you can offline store a variety of things. I can tell you, I think the intention right now, and it's going to be up for debate in the future because ours is fairly still a young system, I think it's going to be an indefinite storage aspect because currently our SACWIS records are. So there we are.
Okay. And Lori, what is your record retention?
Well, in consultation with our Attorney General's office, the guidance that they've given is that for our paper, I'll call them paper, our paper intakes that are accepted for assessment, we have to keep those for 10 years. And then our rejected intakes, we have to keep for 5. We don't currently have the ability to label our recorded calls, whether they were accepted or rejected, so we just intend to keep them all for 10 years at this point. We've not been recording for the full 10 years yet. We started in 2010, so we've not yet hit our 10 years. Storage has not been an issue so far, but our plan is simply to probably offload, 10 years in 1 day, offload to a, disk storage or something, but then quickly entertain, okay, how long do we have to keep those, and let's just get rid of them if we don't have to keep them. But server storage space will become an issue for us at some point, so we'll have to have some sort of either offloading storage or, as we talked about, more of a hard storage versus the server storage, but we've just not hit it yet. So,
right, and I'm assuming that you're starting to plan because that stuff will creep up on you very, very fast. Very fast, yes. Okay, Linda.
So the state of New Jersey keeps our calls for 99 years.
Allegedly.
Since none of us will be there to see if that's true, that's what we are told.
And there's servers like for us, we can hotline staff, the administration has access to calls for 7 years on a server that's here physically in a building, and then anything after 7 years is stored at an off-site server.
Okay. 99 years. Interesting. So let's move on to, I'm sure, a topic that everyone is very curious about, and we're going to start with Linda. And the question is, what security measures are in place to protect the data?
So, as I said, the server is here on property, and it is, stored and locked via key and card key to get into our cold room, right? It is not accessible to anybody but the IT staff. Our data on the server is not encrypted currently. It is something that we've looked into. Obviously, all the equipment here is firewalled off. We have actually several firewalls between ourselves and the NICE facility for where the other servers are contained. And, you know, we, again, just punch an individual hole through for that. If anybody wants the specific details, I'm happy to give that to everybody offline. I don't want to get into all of that secret squirrel stuff here on the call. So we really haven't had any issues, but we always are concerned, and you always hear stories of breaches or attempted breaches, and state OIT, you know, alerts us when people try to hack into their system, et cetera. So we have begun discussions about whether, you know, it would be in our best interest to, in some way, you know, encrypt those calls when they're at rest on the server. We haven't made a decision. We've just started those conversations. Honestly, it's probably something that we will do just because of how the world is today, unfortunately. I don't know that, you know, I can't honestly say that I think there's a huge, that I feel at risk or I lose sleep over this particular server that I have, given what's on it. But it is something that, you know, that we are, you know, considering.
Absolutely. And Lori, what security measures are in place in Iowa?
Sure. So let me just start with the higher level. So we, you know, servers are in locked rooms. Obviously, we've got the servers are encrypted. We have a contractor who actually sort of manages our call recording, our IVR system. So we have business associate agreements with them. You know, they have to follow all the applicable laws and confidentiality rules, that sort of thing. I don't believe we encrypt at rest, but if we happen to, because we're not linked, remember, if we happen to route a recorded call to someone, so let's just say our ombudsman's office inquires and, you know, they're entitled to all information. So if we have to route that, it goes through an email encryption process. So we really, because we're not linked, again, in our SACWA system, our security measures are probably a little bit different, but that's what we've got in place right now. And we only allow a certain group of people, so only our intake manager, the supervisors, myself as the service area manager, and a couple of other folks, IT folks, would have access to those recorded calls. So, you know, our field assessors can't go in and just, you know, peruse around and listen to calls. Nobody else can really access that to listen. So small group of people have the ability to do that.
Okay. And Jack?
Yeah, this was a huge issue when we rolled out our hotline. We actually had to go through a series of certifications, Hipaa security compliance. We have our state OIT compliance. Our server array and storage array for our system is actually stored in the statewide OIT data center, which then is this particular array, because of the level of security we had to have with it along with being encrypted, is also actually stored behind chain link, and in that regard is also has got a significant firewall division or block on it, so that we're very, very concerned about the security, the access, and all the aspects related to that array. Nothing else resides on that server array, nothing else. So there's no way any other application could end up causing us to get a backdoor into it. So we took a lot of extreme measures and quite frankly, costs to ensure the security aspects of that were maintained. Also, from the user access standpoint, if you think about it, you know, every caseworker, every person in the world out there has access, but as you probably do too, I mean, everything we have access to is we have profiles built as to who can have access to what and who can actually listen to what and who can do what. And so we have also implemented different levels of profile security too. I think that also controls that aspect of it. So you have to have certain levels of certification to get to that point. And so that is the physical security standpoint of what we have.
Great. So let's move on now, and we're going to start with Lori. Basically, we want you to explain to us how you use the recordings. Do you use them for evidence, for customer service, or both, or something else?
Thanks. Yep, we kind of talked about this in the first question, I think. But so we use, mostly, we use those calls for quality assurance and improvement efforts. We've got a couple of lead workers that sit in this centralized intake unit along with the supervisors and staff, and those lead workers will do a call review, and so periodically they're pulling a sample, they're listening to the call, they're looking at the intake, and make the paper, I'm using the term paper even though it's really electronic, but looking at the written intake just to be sure that we're capturing as much pertinent information as possible, certainly not word for word, but are we getting the best information documented that we need to, and then providing feedback to the supervisors to use in their one-on-one staffing with their folks, just for development purposes. We're looking for trends, training issues that we might have to address, that sort of thing. So mostly for quality improvement.
Okay.
When necessary, we'll use it to respond to a customer complaint. So if I get a reporter who calls and says, I was on hold for an hour and, your intake worker, Sally, was so rude to me and I don't think I was heard, and, then it's really easy for me to say, thanks for the information. Certainly we want to provide good customer service. Let me listen to the call, and I can get back to them. So that's been really helpful when we've had to use it. And typically when we talk about in those customer complaints, let me listen to the recording, the tone of the complaint call kind of changes. So it has been helpful in sort of de-escalating some of those complaints. As I mentioned earlier, we do use those recordings when we're dealing with some performance and disciplinary issues as well. If we have a high-profile case and, there's some question as to whether folks handled things correctly, and we go back and we listen to a call and we see that, maybe this worker that we've told 3 or 4 times they need to, do this thing better, and the recording shows that they didn't, we will use those in, setting folks on a corrective action path. But we haven't had to do that very much, and so typically it's not around the call recording, but rather other indicators that we've got, and the call recording just sort of supports that effort. We have not been asked to provide information to judges or attorneys or mandatory reporters, but we're concerned that we're going to have to deal with that at some point. As I've been on some of these other webinars related to centralizing intake and call recordings and things, it's becoming apparent that folks are sometimes now being asked to provide all kinds of electronic communications to requesters like attorneys or judges. So we know we're going to have to deal with that part too. We've not been asked, other than if we have, as I said, like an ombudsman or a legislator who somehow does have access to the information, we'll share it. But moving forward, if we start to get requests for that kind of thing, we're going to have some procedures that we don't currently have in place around, geez, can we do this? Do we, we have to redact everything? What does that look like? So it'll be something we have to deal with. We've just not yet had to.
Well, let's find out if Linda and Jack have had to deal with it. So, Linda.
So we have provided recordings as evidence in not an unusually high amount. I would say it's really an exception. But there's been, a dozen or so.
It's probably more than a dozen, but it doesn't happen all that often. They have to go through a court order to get them. Like sometimes we get calls or requests from law enforcement because we may loop them in and they want to listen to a call. At times they may have to get a court order, and or if it's not like a case that's going on, or at times they have to send like a request through our central operations, through our legal affairs to see if we would be able to help them with that. We just can't automatically give them those calls. And at times, if a case is litigated and for some reason the judge or one of the attorneys wants to hear a particular call during the court proceedings, then through a court order we do record the call for them.
Or we provide the recording.
We copy the call for them.
Right.
And it's encrypted also so that not everyone could just get the disc and be able to listen to it.
Right. If we send any type of data, including calls, outside of this building, it is encrypted automatically. It can't go anywhere unless it's been encrypted. That is built in. The other, I think, bigger piece is that it is used for quality assurance, right? So the supervisors can listen to the calls.
Well, our supervisors are required to listen to a set amount of calls each week for their screeners for quality assurance and for training purposes. So most of the recordings are used in that way at the hotline to review the call to make sure that we're providing good customer service, that we are engaging and professional, and that we also are coding the calls correctly. So we use that as a training piece and as a supervisory tool. And also when it's a call about, if it's a CPS call, Child Protective Service, then that's also attached so that the investigator can have that as a tool for their investigation. So we use it in all those.
And we've had some high-profile case situations that have been captured in the media, and the beauty of that is our executive staff from our commissioner and her direct reports have been able to directly listen to calls as well to get a better feel for the screen and practice.
Thank you. And Jack, I know you have a bit of a different response, so tell us what yours.
Yeah, ours got a whole lot more complicated with 64 different counties, and being that they manage their calls. We take the stance here, and what we have is they own their record, they own their case. We supervise it, they follow the rules, and we guide it. So there's a lot of different things that happens as it pertains to the recordings in that regard. So let's just, once again, keep in mind, if you can fathom, if you're going to record calls, so you have 64 different counties recording calls differently on different systems, how do you do that? Well, you can't. So we ended up having to create this cloud-based system for all of our call routing purposes, and literally was the only way that we could capture all the data we needed and be able to have an integrated system. That took a lot of working out with the counties, as you can imagine. Before I did this, I'll just say I was a county commissioner, so when I took this job, it really provided a benefit to be able to have access to all the elected officials to be able to say, we need your support in driving this issue. And so that really helped us from that standpoint, I would have to say, and in being able to get their cooperation in this. So why is that key? Well, because the counties own it, we just have some guiding principles. We don't release recordings. The only places that can listen to recordings are ombudsman, child welfare divisions from every county by a certified person, or ombudsman, child welfare, or our fatality review team. After that, our recordings are locked down, and we have had requests from courts, and we've had requests from attorneys for our recordings, and the answer is no. We will give you a scripted version of the recording. It will be redacted so that we protect the names and the anonymity of any individuals in there, and we don't provide the recordings because voices can jeopardize anonymity. And so as a result of that, we have not, and no DA, no court, nowhere so far has been successful in Colorado, because our AG's office will protect that issue. And we've had some court cases on it from the past, by the way, too. So we do not release our recordings to the public. We don't release them to the courts or the judicial systems. And the only, like I said, the other thing we do is release it to other entities within inside for quality control purposes and review purposes. I would also say that from a customer service standpoint, this is a critical point when you have a web-based system with multiple endpoints. If you were centralized, it becomes, I think, you can control the outcomes in a different way. By being decentralized, you've got 64 different managers, bosses, supervisors, and call takers shops, you can say. And so as a result of that, when a call comes in, the real question becomes is how do you control the quality of that? Well, you have the local supervisors, but it's state supervised. So we have an administrative review division that actually reviews all our cases, and they actually do have an individual who listens to recordings on a random basis. But I want to rephrase that, because here's how something else happens. Because we have 64 counties, all of our calls will route through our system and back to the county. The counties take their own calls, except when the counties are not available, it will roll back to our state call center, and we will take the call and the report. Okay? We have guidelines you follow for assuming and taking that report. At the same point, we have counties now who are contracting with the state for us to take their calls on their behalf, and we still then give them those reports. Every record we have is marked with a series of statuses, and one of those statuses is pending. And why that's critical is we can very quickly search into our record base and we can say, this call shows pending. Did somebody take this call? Has anybody written it up? Has it been submitted to be DNR'd or red teamed? Is there a record of it in trails in our SACWA system? So we can mark down and we can follow the status of every record, and in that record then is the associated recording so that we can ensure that we know what the type of call it was so that it's categorized correctly and managed correctly. So from a quality service standpoint, as well as from a customer service standpoint, we can review it, which is critical because if our state call center group takes a call, a county needs to review that, okay, for quality. I'm going to tell you, it's also very critical because you have here, because it's decentralized and the counties manage it, they have different parameters for operating hours. So you have your business day operating hours and you have your nighttime operating hours. And so what happens, a lot of counties were utilizing law enforcement to take their after-hours calls. In other words, they would accept the call and then they would get a hold of an on-call worker. And that presented some issues. And what the recordings enabled us to do was to show, in reality, not just that, but answering services, what happened after hours. And so there's been a lot of change in Colorado in our after-hours call management process as a result of what we learned from those recordings from a quality improvement perspective. So the recordings here are multifaceted for us. We use them for a lot of reasons. You have 64 different diverse entities, 64 different counties who all have to follow certain guidelines and rules, as well as we have our 65th county, which is the state call center, which we call the Hotline County Connection Center. And we have 22 individuals there that take calls on a 24/7 basis too. So there's how we use them.
Well, we just heard three very diverse uses of the recordings and state policies and laws, et cetera. So that was all very, very interesting. And let's move on now to the next question. We're going to start with Jack. Do you have any plans to change your software or procedures?
I retire in a year, so the answer is no. No, just the answer is no. In fact, we're very pleased where we're at and what we're doing. We're not seeing any changes whatsoever in our processes and procedures as it pertains to recordings. I would have to say that we're frankly quite pleased as to where it sits at this point in time. Great.
Linda?
So I don't have any immediate plans, but I do have plans it is in the planning stages to look. We're always looking for something better, newer, something that can, do more, and why I can't verbalize today what all that is. We'll know it when we see it. So we're happy and the workers are happy with the calls and having them linked. We're not 100% happy with the current hardware and the system we're using. We're also moving to voice over IP, so I think that may push us into having to change things sooner too. So we've started to look. So we're not planning on changing anything tomorrow, but I believe in the near future we will be taking that on.
So for New Jersey, it's more from a technical perspective?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Lori?
No plans to change anything at this time, but again, as I mentioned earlier, we're heading into our SACWIS planning, and so I would guess that we would not change anything until we really get into developing the requirements for that new system. So I would say status quo for us right now.
Okay. And obviously rework is very expensive, so that's probably a fantastic idea. Moving on to the last question, and we'll start with Linda. Do you have any lessons learned that you can share with Title IV agencies to assist them in their efforts if they are interested in reporting intake calls?
So I think we've touched on the other co-presenters, and we've all touched on this. I think it's really about doing that work up front, the compatibility with your SACWIS or now CWIS system, to take the time to really understand the requirements before you move forward. If there's a better product and you have, for me specifically, I would say, look, we are all constrained by whatever our requirements are to make purchases. But if you feel that product, A is better than B, then, do your due diligence to try to fight for B. We understand you may end up with A because that's happened to us all. But, take the time to make the case for that product. I think it's been very successful in New Jersey, and I would encourage all states, to record their calls and to have them attached. I think the real lesson learned is the positive feedback that we receive from the caseworkers who feel that they are more prepared to go out and engage with families after listening to the calls. It also, Robin didn't mention this, but, her staff was really nervous about recording the calls because their fear was that caseworkers were going to call them up and yell at them and say, well, why'd you code this, or why'd you do it, that? It actually gave the caseworkers a whole new appreciation for the work that the screening staff do, right? Mm-hmm. And that's even happened here with some of the high-profile cases, that Nancy mentioned, and, where, again, we don't release the calls to the media, but when, executive staff has had, to listen to calls, sometimes their perception has very much changed with how things went down or what happened. It really offered a new insight into what goes on, in those 10 minutes or however long you're on the call with somebody. So I really think it's worthwhile. Yes, it's difficult, but I do think, that the benefits that we've received here in New Jersey from it, from all different areas, has been worth it. Don't give up. You can do it.
A new appreciation. Jack.
One, I would have to echo what Linda and Robin just provided. I mean, Linda is absolutely right on, I think, with a lot of what you're saying. I would say that probably if you're just beginning, and we have the luxury of actually, one would say we're still in our infancy stage. It's only 3.5 years old, the way I look at it. So we went out and looked for all the latest technologies, and then we had to step up in a lot of cases to address a lot of our issues that we had by using such. I would highly recommend, if you're looking at something, make sure you don't end up locking yourself into a specific technology that I worked in that field, by the way, for 35 years before I joined the state. To lock yourself into a technology for whatever reason. We really worked hard to make sure we found a vendor who also had access to and could show some API applications interface development for us to send us data that we needed. But I'm going to tell you the one thing we did that I think really, really helped us, and it's a luxury we had here, and on the other hand, it can be a curse too, but we have people on our OIT staff who are dedicated to the hotline functions that we have and to our SACWIS system, and because we went to a WebNet and we're moving to our SEQUIS system now, which is going to be a WebNet-based system, whenever we have a change or a need, or we have something that we learned along the way, we got to tweak that one, or we need to do this a little bit better, the flexibility of our system and that upfront intake piece was so good that they could program those changes, and we could get some of those changes we had made overnight, and which was fantastic. So I really highly recommend that that whatever you do, you get something that's flexible and dynamic, as Linda, I think, was referring to. And I know, Lori, as you guys move forward, I know on some of your stuff, just really encourage you looking at those kinds of things and having staff on hand who can help you go in and make those changes as you need them to, because it's we're talking about children here. So thank you.
Great. And Lori, we'll let you finish up with the question session. So what lessons learned can you add?
Wow. Okay. So we have lots, and I would echo a lot of what Linda and Jack have already said. But I think starting in the beginning, when we centralized in 2010, our agency was in a bit of a a state of chaos because we were reorganizing our service areas and all kinds of things were happening at one time. So as we entered into the recording of calls, I would say there wasn't much down the road thinking going on at the time. Rather, it was protection and looking at performance, but not much else. And I think you really have to think about, if you're implementing a call recording system, what is your end goal? I mean, what do you want to use the information for? Do you want the call recording data, the hard data, to help you inform staffing levels or skill sets that are needed, that sort of thing? Do you want to be able to share it with the assessors? Do you only want to keep it in-house? Just how you'll use it. Really explore all of that. And so I'm kind of wishing at the time that we centralized and started recording that we'd had a webinar like this, because one of the things that you really need to do is to learn from other states, I think. So I've appreciated the opportunity to hear from Jack and Linda today. We, too, even though we started in 2010, I would say that we're still infants in the way that we are using our system. And part of the lesson learned for me is that when we began recording without an end goal in mind, really, what we've had to struggle through are things like labeling and storage. We should be able to label our calls a little differently to make searching for things easier. That was not initially talked about when we implemented, so it's taken some, reconfiguration. So every time we have sort of a new revelation about how we want to use the information, it takes time, resources, dollars, So end goal in mind, and really explore what all you might need to have in the way of a system. And to Jack's point, really purchasing something that is flexible for you. Making sure that you understand your retention laws and have policies to address that kind of thing, because it's going to come up. I'm trying to think of, how will you handle the various requests for the information? We've talked a lot today about, ombudsmen, legislators, the media, all kinds of folks who might want to have the information. So having policies around that are well known by all that you can stand on. So along with that is the security, making sure that you've got proper security in place for storage, for routing, all of that. Deciding whether you want, every state is different, but in Iowa, what we do, our intake staff have to staff calls where they intend to reject the report and not send out an assessor. They have to staff those calls with their supervisor. Some of those staff choose to get up out of their chairs, which I think is healthy in a call center environment, and go to their supervisor to staff that case. Others simply call the supervisor from their phone. Those calls are recorded. So that's another thing that you'd want to make sure you think about. Do you want those supervisor to staff calls recorded? If yes, how will you use them? If no, is that going to get you hung up later when you need the information? Honestly, we have benefited from having those supervisor and staffings recorded. We've used them a couple of times, and it's been super helpful. So let's see, what else? Ensuring that you have the ability to know when your call recording function might glitch and stop recording calls. We're in a situation right now where we as the business user don't know until we have to go looking for something. And then, we might find calls stopped recording 2 days ago and we didn't know it. So we're working with our vendor now to try to get some sort of proactive alert. So that's something to keep in mind as well. We shouldn't have to worry about our calls not recording. So those are some things, I think, high level that I would say pay attention to. That's really it, I think, from my perspective.
And thank you, all three of you. Those are very valuable lessons learned, and that's what helps our colleagues so much. So that concludes the panelist discussion portion of the roundtable, which we certainly hope was informative and helpful to you. So I would now like to invite my colleague Nick to run the Q&A session. And remember that you can use the chat box to type your comments or questions, or press *1 on your phone to access the operator's assistance to speak to the group. Nick?
Hello, everyone. This is Nick. Operator, would you please remind the group about how they can submit a question over the phone?
Certainly. If you would like to ask a question over the phone, please press *, then 1. Please unmute your phone and record your name at the prompt. If at any time your question has been answered while still in the queue, you can remove your request by pressing star 2. Once again, that is star 1 for questions over the phone.
Thank you. So we have one question in the chat box that I'll start with right now and then a couple more after that. What is the typical length of time for a report phone call? Is time a challenge for investigators listening to the call recording?
Anyone can jump in and respond.
In New Jersey, our calls range, our average calls are in between like 12 and 18 minutes. Of course, some can be longer. Including that time and sometimes hold times, because we put callers on hold so that we can check our system, and the investigators can fast forward past those hold times, but sometimes you have to check in again to make sure that you're not missing anything. So I don't think it deters them from listening to a call. I think some of our more challenging calls that could be a deterrent are when we use the language line to assist in our calls. They typically are like 40 minutes to an hour navigating that whole system. And I think at times after you've listened to one of those calls, you may not want to listen to another one because there's a lot of going back and forth. But those are the only ones that are a challenge, I think, are the ones that we use our language line for assistance. But other than that, they normally range between 12 and 18 minutes.
This is Jack from Colorado. Ours, it gets a little bit complicated from that standpoint. So if we have a very, very extensive enhanced screening guide or screening process with a pretty long laundry list of questions that we have to go through. And as I mentioned before, we have an administrative review division, and that's one of their things they do is to check to see if you've asked each and every question appropriately. So as a result of that, some of our calls are will last as long as 30 minutes. We've had some calls that get a little more complicated and lasted as long as 50 minutes. That's if that is a child welfare referral situation or a report of neglect or abuse. If it's more along the line of just a follow-up inquiry, all of our other calls, we average anywhere between a minute to 6 minutes, but those other ones that require enhanced screening can get lengthy.
Yeah, so this is Lori in Iowa. I've kind of forgotten the scope of the original question because I've been making notes from the other presenters, but we have about a 4-minute wait time. Our talk time is usually, I don't know, on average between 12 and 15 minutes, sometimes squeaking into 18 minutes, but on average about the same as Linda mentioned. And then we allow about a 15-minute work time, so they're doing some additional lookups, they're getting the intake, written up in the system and routed and all of that. So that's kind of from start to finish our time frame.
Thank you very much. I think that does capture it. I'm going to move on to the next question, and then afterwards I'll see if there are any questions over the phone. So the next question, any regrets about your move to call recording, such as costs, storage, retrieval, other tech issues, or negative legal consequences?
New Jersey has no regrets.
No regrets in Iowa either.
Colorado, no regrets. In fact, would highly recommend you do move to it. It will improve your child protection services.
Thank you very much. Operator, do we have any questions over the phone?
Yes, we did have one come in from Dawn. Your line is open.
I need to talk.
Dawn, your line is open if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, I wanted to find out what is some of the most important. I know we want to capture everything when we record, capturing during the call, and if you can just tell me what they are. As far as like the wait time, quality of work, QAA, either the length of time the person stayed on the phone, the average call time, handling time, AHT.
This is Jack. I will say from from Colorado's perspective, we took a more simplistic approach to this issue. There's a couple of different ways you can look at how you manage intake and call takers. And like I said, I've worked in that industry for 30, 35 years. But here we kept it very simple. Our biggest key was, period, and as a mandate from the legislature, every call has to be answered live. And our primary 100% goal was to never lose the possibility of, or have the possibility of losing a potential report of neglect or abuse. So as a result of that driving factor right there, what we pushed on the most and what we really track are three key measures, period. One is what is our, and this is managed, all 64 counties, we track it as well as our main center. What is your speed of answer or acceptance rate? Because that is a direct correlation on availability and making sure that people don't get tired and hang up. And what is your abandonment rates? We drive those two factors. Length of call, the rest of it, hey, the case is a case-by-case-by-case basis. We don't try to drive a call down in its length. You've got to get the information. Let's get it, and whatever it takes to work with that reporter, you do. But we use those other factors such as abandonment rates and acceptance rates in an ability to try to determine, do we have a problem? By the way, often it determines if we have a technical problem going on at a county or at a location. But so we watch those, and I look right here. We have a control center. Every one of our people have up and running the entire status of our entire statewide network, 7/24. It's monitored all the time, and we can begin to find if we have a trouble happening by using those rate factors.
Okay. And I got another question. What kind of phone system do y'all use? Right now, we use the Verizon InContact. I'm looking at enhancing our program and restructuring the whole program in the state of Virginia. But I'm looking for a phone system that can basically auto-record the calls for quality assurance, and then look at calculating the average wait time in the queue, pre-queue, without having to do like the calculation So what kind of phone system do y'all use for y'all agencies?
New Jersey uses the Avaya phone system, and as a subcontract, Avaya used NICE, as that's where the recording piece comes into play.
So, within our automated call distribution system, our Avaya system, it does have those types of reports that you wouldn't have to do anything manually. You would just need to learn or set up your phone systems to make sure that you can capture that information. But we were always able to see, like, every half an hour increment of how many calls are received, how many calls are abandoned, not the average rate until like the end of the day, but we are able to see stuff in real time, which is very helpful.
Absolutely.
Can you spell that, please?
Yeah.
Spell the name of the system.
It's A as in Apple, V as in Victor, A as in Apple, Y as in Yellow, A as in Apple.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Jack in Colorado. We actually, because we have 64 different counties, have to work with 64 diverse systems. So we don't have a phone system as our central point. We are a web-based system. So everything is forwarded into a primary centralized system. So every phone system is decentralized, and then everything then routes through our central system and goes back to the counties, and then in that way we capture the data we're using. But would like to just reiterate one little factor for you from 35 years of experience in call centers. Avaya is a very good product, so New Jersey, congratulations.
And of course, we don't promote or suggest.
No, we don't. We're not.
Product.
But it will provide that data. I will just say that.
Perfect. Thank you.
In Iowa, we use a Cisco system and an IVR system, and so we've got we actually have wall boards that are mounted up high in our intake office, and so supervisors are able to manage movement of staff from calls. So if somebody has just taken a call and they're off on work time, then if we have a high call volume, supervisors can put a person back in the phone queue to take those calls during high volume call time. So we really like our system so far. We track on hold time, talk time, work time, which then equates to handle time, volume of calls at any given time, no calls in queue. So just a variety of data that helps manage, moment to moment, day to day in that call center kind of environment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is Nick again. Operator, do we have any more questions over the phone?
We do have one more from Candy. Your line is open.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Candy, and I'm from Louisiana, and I have actually two questions. The first one being that at the beginning of the webinar or the roundtable discussion, it was stated that we were going to have the ability to, or that the webinar was being recorded. So how can we access that after we disconnect? Just in case I've missed information I was writing as fast as I could, but this is some very good information that I was wanting to share with our
Yes, the
staff.
webinar is being recorded, and it'll be made available online. So when it is complete and posted, you will all be getting a message sent to you announcing the availability, which will be on the Children's Bureau website.
Okay, awesome. And my second question is, I know that we're not able to endorse, particular call centers, but is there any way that you could share with us the call centers that y'all currently are using?
This is Lori in Iowa. So when I reference call center, that is my centralized intake unit. It's a call center environment in that that's what they do. They're not out doing, child protective assessments, that sort of thing. They're simply taking the calls, making a judgment about whether it should be an accepted intake or a rejected intake, logging all of that, documenting all of that, and then moving on to the next call. So for me, my call center is my centralized intake.
Okay, so maybe I probably should ask, the system that some of you are using. I know one of you are using the Cisco system.
Joyce, can we say?
New Jersey's using Avaya and NICE.
Okay.
Colorado uses a variety of systems, but our central collecting data system is the CenturyLink Genesis system.
Okay. All right. Thank y'all very much.
This is Nick again. I have a few more questions in the chat box, and as a reminder, if individuals have additional questions, they're welcome to enter them into the chat box or to call over the phone. So this next question is, did you find that by allowing the field caseworkers access to the calls, did it reduce the amount of documentation that needed to be captured on the report? Was there a reduction in quotes, proving the report as being appropriate?
Hi, this is New Jersey. We didn't find that it reduced the amount of time that was needed to document the report in our SACWIS system. The recording at times, actually, which was a helpful tool, our screeners are able to access their calls at their desk in an event that they missed something on a call. So sometimes it adds to the screening process, but not in a negative way. They just want to make sure that they were able to grasp all the information that they needed if they felt as though they missed something during a call. So they don't always listen to every single call, but when needed, they utilize that as a tool.
Colorado found that it improved our initial intake process, we believe, and I think I'd have to ditto what Linda said, that it's a case by case, but it sure did give them the opportunity to go back and make sure they got everything. And if they didn't, by the way, they could have the information, could easily go back and verify names, verify phone numbers, verify addresses, as well as then if they have to call them back and follow up, they can.
Thank you very much. And another question. Are the recordings provided in court discovery?
So this is Linda from New Jersey. So with a court order, we will provide the calls, to the court. They are not attached to every litigation case that we have. They are only attached if the court requests it or defense attorney or even our deputy attorney generals, if they want it, it has to be a separate request. It is not part of every litigation case.
And our legal affairs department actually processes it. So the hotline may copy the call, but then it goes through our legal affairs office for distribution to the appropriate parties.
In Colorado, it's managed by the counties. However, they are not provided to courts. What they are provided with is a scripted version of the record, word for word, that is redacted.
Yeah, in Iowa, our field assessment workers don't have access to the calls, so don't routinely have those calls. To my knowledge, they've not been asked to provide those.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions in the chat box, and I believe we're going to wrap up questions at around 2:50 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So the next question is, how many workers do you have in your call centers?
In New Jersey, we have 89 screeners full-time. We have 17 supervisors full-time, and we have 4 assistant administrators and 1 administrator. So I'm saying full-time because we do have to supplement our operations at times during the weekends and with on holidays with part-time staff. So we have people who work at the hotline full-time who serve in a part-time capacity, and we also have folks who are in our department that also work as screeners part-time on weekends and holidays. So I have 62 of those type workers that help supplement the operation.
This is Lori. In Iowa, I feel so small right now. We have 23 social work staff who man our abuse intake lines. They are supervised by 4 supervisors. We, as I mentioned earlier, have 2 lead social work staff who do kind of our quality improvement, our training, that sort of thing. And then we've got 1 social work administrator as the manager for that unit. We take, to clarify, which I didn't earlier and should have, we are not a 24/7 operation. We are business hours only. And so our nights and weekends process is a little bit different. I don't think it's important to talk about that today because there's no call recording attached to that. But during business hours, it's my staff who then take all those calls. They, about 54,000 calls a year, I think. Each one handles between, depending on how many staff are out, 10 to 15 reports a day. So your supervisors then are handling about, 60, 70 decisions a day. Rough math. Please don't, rough math. I don't do math well. But we're kind of a smaller unit compared to the other 2 entities on the phone, I think.
So in Colorado, we're distributed, and as I said earlier, we're in the process now, and we're young, where counties can contract with the state to take their calls on their behalf. We have a unique arrangement because 95% of our call volume comes from 10 counties of the 64. So keeping that in mind, currently we take the calls for 44 of those counties. Those are all the medium to small counties. We have 1 large county we do after hours for. The large counties average on hand, depending on how they set their operation up, because some do all of their prep work for DNR and red teaming and stuff with their intakes, some don't. So it varies, but on average, between 6 and 9 people per county. So you're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60. And in addition to that, the call center, the statewide call center, has 22 people that man that, and those 22 are actually 2 supervisors, a manager, and 19 call takers. And that is about the gist of it. And they are 24/7 at the statewide system.
Thank you very much. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate all the time that our panelists have put together in terms of responding to these questions. It sounds like there are many more out there as well. So what I encourage each of you to do, because I recognize that we did not get to a question from Ms. Carolyn Kearney, and if there are any questions over the phone as well, there will be information provided later about where you can submit those questions, because we want to ensure that you get those answers. With that, it looks like we are about to transition on to wrapping up this presentation. So Joyce, I'm going to let you take it over from here. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Next slide, please. Because we thought that Mr. Hilbert from Colorado was not going to be able to join us, we did include an overview of their process, of the Colorado Hotline recording process. So we created a bit of a reference library. And I just want to step through these. I'm not going to speak to them. Next slide, please.
The guiding factors for the Colorado Hotline recording. Bullet points include every call answered live and recorded, easily accessible, linked statewide management system, secure and controlled access, and appropriately archived.
Okay, you've heard Jack talk about all this. Next slide.
A visual diagram of the routing platform for the Colorado Hotline. The diagram outlines the several paths on which a caller may be guided on their way to being connected with a live representative.
This, I think, will be of great interest to a lot of folks. It's a visual diagram of their actual routing platform. Next slide.
An example of how the Trails Hotline application tracks information. The sample shows the call information, including the call taker's name and county location, call date and time, referral ID, and the duration of the call recording. The call information is linked to the case management record. The recording can be played back through the default PC media player.
Again, part of that routing platform in terms of how it's recorded into their Trails application. Next slide.
The slide is entitled Secure Access and Archived. Bullet points include password access via case management system, certified hotline/caseworkers, and management. Recordings cannot be downloaded and saved. Encrypted behind state firewall. Hipaa compliant. Archival policy, 18 years plus 7 years plus 1 day. AG ruling, scripted/redacted version of the recordings only.
Security, next slide.
The slide is entitled Benefits. Benefits include performance measurement and quality assurance tool, training, accountability ensuring call takers follow rule, practice, and policy, insight how a community's calls should be managed, added protection for children and workers, follow-up analysis and complaint investigations, technical troubleshooting tool.
The benefits, next slide. So that brings us to the wrap-up. And again, the presentation has been recorded, so you will get a live version or a recorded version of this discussion. And also, I believe you can download the PowerPoint if you so choose. So I want to thank our panelists, Lori, Linda, Jack. What a marvelous job.
Contact information for the presenters is as follows. Lori Lipscomb, email llipscomb1@dhs.state.ia.us. Linda Holland, email linda.holland@dcf.nj.gov. Jack Hilbert, email jack.hilbert@state.co.us.
Again, the availability of the recorded version will be put out and available on the Children's Bureau website. And as we move forward in the webinar series, we have an upcoming event in July. The presentation will be about data exchanges with the Social Security Administration, and then August is yet to be determined. So I want to thank all of you for attending. I hope, again, this was very informative, and I appreciate the time spent by our panelists. So that ends the roundtable discussion. Thank you and goodbye.